Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Katie. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. I feel like, just for some background, I'll have a link in my show notes to the interview that Tracy did with me for her podcast. But Tracy and I were both in this ADHD summit in 2022, and that's how I guess we kind of reached out to each other. You reached out to me, and I had such a wonderful conversation with you on your podcast, and I'm so excited to be able to speak again and hear your story for this podcast. So, why don't we get started? I guess I'd love to hear about when you were first diagnosed with ADHD. How old were you? What was going on in your family at the time? And what were some of those aha moments for you where you were like, oh, I really should get this checked out?
Yes, absolutely. And in ADHD style, it's kind of a roundabout journey.
I know, right? You're always like, where do I begin?
There is no real straight line. But so I guess I'll start from the beginning-ish to today. About 20 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with ADHD. And her doctor had said, and of course they put her on Ritalin, which worked for moments for her. But her doctor said, your kids will more than likely have it. And my mother, I love my mother dearly, but she's a big, like genetics is her thing. Like if I have it, you're going to have it. And I was like, you know what? I'm good. I'm all good, Mom. I don't need that. I don't need that. And I'm doing just fine, but not really, because before she shared that with me, I had been an emotional roller coaster. And I had some trauma from my childhood and just these gigantic emotions. And I had actually been diagnosed with clinical depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. Now, the depression and the anxiety, yes, I could see. The bipolar just didn't really, as I would look through the symptoms, and I just don't feel like that's it. Now, after probably 20 medications to address the depression and anxiety and the bipolar, nothing worked. And I was spent, it was maybe a full year of trying medication after medication. And then my mother says, well, you know what? You probably have ADHD. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess that explains the focus part, because I am, like I said, I'm kind of, tell the story in a roundabout way. And that's kind of been my life. But so around that time, I met a friend who was a psychologist, and he kind of took me in the back door of his office and did and he had ADHD. His partner had ADHD. And I'm like, well, can you just check it out? And he was like, oh, honey, you failed miserably. Of course you have ADHD. I was like, oh, okay, great. And then that was it. I kind of just left it. And that was about 20 years ago. Had my son, and that was a traumatic birth and very different from what I had expected. And then had his sister 17 months later. And in that, when I think my oldest was 3, I just had a breakdown. Like I just couldn't take any more. Pull my life apart, didn't know what to do, but I was like, something has to change. Of course, it was me. I'm the one that had to change. So I guess I'll fast forward now to the pandemic and virtual 6th grade for my youngest, and getting her diagnosed. And then really doing, when my kids need something, I'm all in, right? I'm all in. We're going to figure this out. That's what I did with my son, and then realized, pointing the finger back at me. I did a lot of work back then. But then this time it was different, because I started researching what it looks like in girls and women. And oh my gosh, Katie, when I started getting in these communities of women with ADHD, I felt like I was at home, like a huge sigh of relief. Like, I'm not as messed up as I thought I was, right? I'm not alone because, like many of us, we feel like we are just this lone ranger, like this square peg trying to fit into a round hole. Always felt like I was on the outskirts, always feeling like the outlander in my life. Still, I still kind of feel like that, like I'm just different than other people. But it's so helpful to know that there are people like you who are sharing all of these stories in these communities that we can dive into and learn that, oh my gosh, it's because of this ADHD, it's because my brain is wired differently. And that's kind of the roundabout. There's so many more things in there, but that's kind of the straightest line I can give you.
Yeah, right. I'm curious because it's funny. I feel like I've talked about the fact that it had dawned on me that I probably had ADHD, but didn't really do much with that information. It sounds like we had a similar experience where I was like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I have it. Who knows? And then there was a moment after the pandemic where, yeah, like I really started doing a deep dive, and then it just hit so deeply in terms of how much this has truly affected so many aspects of my life.
Right.
And you were saying that the diagnosis, I'm curious about the diagnosis of bipolar, because that was something that I've talked about on the podcast. I often thought I had because of that pendulum between manic energy and lethargy, right? Like just literally not being able to get myself off the couch, and seeing that now through this lens of ADHD. Is that what was going on with you, or kind of what do you think led to that diagnosis?
Yeah, apparently bipolar has, no, I am not a clinician or anything, but apparently there are different types of bipolar. And what I was diagnosed with was cyclothymia, I think. And it's where I never really had those super high highs. I had the lows, but I tended to stay low. And so cyclothymia, I believe, is where you're less than contented. You're less than content. And that was me. That was my most of my life is feeling less than content, and then dipping. So I didn't really do the highs, but I did dip. Actually, there was about a decade where I was below content for most of a decade, where I just couldn't get myself out. There was a lot going on too, but it was the emotional piece is the piece that I didn't understand about ADHD. If I had known this back then, I would have taken a different path. Right. But that was huge to me, that was when we think of ADHD, and for most of us, when we're diagnosed with ADHD, it's about focus. Oh, well, just get on some Ritalin or something and that'll help you focus. I was like, you know what? I'm managing okay. I've got my OCD to keep me under control here. So I kind of swept it under the rug is what I did. So yeah, I never had the real high highs and the real low lows, but I had the kind of midway to low.
Yeah. Gosh, I feel like that says so much about my story too. And many of us, right? Which is that feeling of like, what's wrong with me that I insist on being so depressed? Right. Like I often felt like, why have I had this pattern of depression throughout my whole life when like, there's not a lot, like I have a lot going for me, and I could recognize that objectively. I had a lovely family and a husband and children. And like, I could never quite understand my insistence on being depressed. And it kind of reminds me of what you're talking about with this idea of like the attention issues and the organizational issues, or some of the focus issues that we tend to associate with ADHD, and instead of the emotional part. And I think many of us have this experience where it's just like, well, if I have organizational issues, then I just need to like write a to-do list, and I just need to focus, and I just need to like apply myself, and all of those things we've heard our whole lives. And then if I can't do it, it means I must not want to, right? I'm lazy. And then so much of it comes down to that self-talk.
Right. Yeah. The what's wrong with me that I can't organize myself enough to go to the grocery store. Okay, I'll find ways around it.
Yeah, right. And I think, it's so hard to articulate for so many of us, like where that feeling of brokenness comes from, because it's not it's not just something that happens overnight. It's happening over the course of our whole lives, of just always feeling like, if I, why can't I just do it? Why can't I do the thing? Right.
Why can't I? Right.
Yeah.
Why can't I? That's a horrible question for us to ask ourselves. Yeah. And Katie, I absolutely loved our conversation and learning more about you, and your story reminds me a lot of me.
Oh,
Things I hear. Well, and through listening to your podcast and everything, like you tell parts of your story. I'm like, oh my gosh. me too.
I know, right? On paper, I feel like we have a lot of similarities that I want to delve into. Now, but I feel like your mother being diagnosed 20 years ago is very rare. I mean, that's pretty incredible.
It is.
Right? I always feel like women who were diagnosed that long ago are kind of unicorns.
Yeah, and like I said, they gave her Ritalin, and now we know, and it worked for little bits when she needed to get her taxes done or different things like that. But what we now understand is we need much more. I mean, if medication works, fantastic, right? But medication is not the only thing. Right. That we need a therapist and or a coach. We need skills, right? And the medication if it works for us. So I feel like she, back then we didn't know better. We didn't know all that we know right now. But she could have been better supported, I think, and understood. Again, it was the focus. Oh, you have ADHD, you can't focus. But the executive functioning skills are not just focus. They're again, I'll say over and over again, because my mother was prone to the depression too. Yeah. But the managing emotions, oh my goodness, that was a huge one.
Right. And I also feel like, it amazes me that the narrative, especially from medical providers, still seems to be, you're diagnosed with ADHD, here's your prescription, good luck to you. Like, that's it. There's no education piece. My son, and I love my doctor to death, but that was my experience was, here's your prescription, good luck. And really perpetuating this idea that this medication is going to solve everything. And then you think about, like, if we're chronically depressed people for the most part, and then we put all of our faith in this medication and it's sort of helpful, but, the placebo wears off. And, then we're left, like you said, with not a lot of skills in terms of how to really, really manage ADHD and our self-concept. I think that's so important. Yeah.
Right. And, as I began really diving into what ADHD looks like in women and girls. And here's the thing. I had Sari Solden's book. I had a stack of ADHD books on my bookshelf that I never touched. They were like, I don't know. I'm not going to get rid of them just yet, but I've had it. They've been on my shelf for 20 years. Right? But one of the other things about that I learned is that socially, I've always struggled. Socially, I have always felt like a square peg, and I've lost a lot of friends as well. Just, I would love to be the kind of person, the kind of friends, like I kind of watch these women who spend all their time together and they talk every day and they, and they know the ins and outs of every part of each other's lives. And I've never been able to do that. I've just, I believe that's focus, but socially it shows, I just feel a little socially awkward.
Yeah. I agree. And I feel like there's many of us who do feel that way. And I don't know if it just comes down to social cues or whatever. Like, I don't know if it's really easy to pinpoint what that is. If it's, we talk about like, oh, I'm terrible at texting. So it's object permanence. But I think there is a lot to it. And I don't know about you, but I feel like for me, part of my post-diagnosis journey has been really kind of radically accepting. Thank you, Sari Solden, for that.
Yes. Oh my God, what a beautiful book.
Oh my goodness. We're talking about the workbook by Sari Solden and Michelle Frank, which is really about how to radically accept the good and the bad of ADHD and reframe some of that bad. And one of the things that I've had to reframe is how I socially relate to people and how, there is a grief there, like you said, that I don't have a lot of the huge network, and I don't have these long-term wonderful friendships. And, this is a time of year, Christmas cards where I'm like, yeah, I don't send any, I don't get any, and those moments of like a FOMO, I guess. But I also kind of feel like, I feel like what I really need is my very, very close-knit family, right? And my partner and my children. And that for me is enough at the end of the day. I don't know. It's hard. It is hard. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because I definitely feel like there are so many of us who share that. I don't know. I feel like it's FOMO, right? I feel like maybe we should have a whole I feel like I really want to explore where that comes from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, I want to find out from you kind of what are, actually I was going to ask you, looking over your life, what were some of the things that you look back and think, oh goodness, the signs were there all along. But then I also don't want to forget to ask you, like, what are some of the books or resources that did finally really influence you in terms of your ADHD?
So when I look back, definitely the friendships. So this is interesting. I had a friend many, many years ago call me a chameleon. And she's like, and it wasn't a compliment. It was that I get into social situations and I'm able to feel energy, right? I'm able to feel what's going on in a room, and then I adjust or I accommodate. And so for her, it was like, you're being fake. And I'm like, I'm not being fake. I'm in this situation. I'm feeling what's needed right now. So, that that little bit stuck in my head for decades that, oh, I'm a chameleon. Like, what's wrong with me? Why am I a chameleon? That's not awesome. But the friendships piece, definitely throughout my entire life. I had to struggle really hard in school, right? I mean, I wasn't failing, but especially in college. College was tough. College was the way that I studied, I think about it now. That's really, if anybody really knew what I had to do to bring in all of that information and to actually, be smack dab in the middle of my class, needing to go, where other people could go to the library and they could study with all the noise going on. I had to go into this darkest hidey hole in the dorm to, so I could be by myself and just gather all of my bits and just like write. And it was kind of crazy. I would pretty much write a book for each, every time I had a test, a book of everything. 'Cause, the getting it through my hand, from my brain through my hand. But just looking back on how difficult it was to just be, a C student, And I remember one time I had I don't know why it happened this way, but I had a professor give a test, that was, he just asked us questions. And we could ask us questions and we answered and we were graded that way. And I thought, oh my gosh, if every teacher could just ask me questions in this way and then I could tell them what I know, they would know that I knew my stuff, right? But the multiple choice and then the essays and that just wasn't, that was challenging. And the emotions, I've always been a crier. I cry when I'm happy. I cry when I'm sad, cry when I'm angry, and all of the emotions. And it's kind of, now I don't care. My kids see me crying and breathing. They're like, oh, mom's breathing again. Crying or laughing or, expressing my big emotions now, in a healthy way. I learned how to do it in a healthy way. But I guess those are the socializing, the schoolwork, and the emotions. Those are the biggest ones when I look back. So it makes sense to me now when I think back on me learning about my ADHD at 20, that when we really just saw it as a focus issue, that, yeah, it's not a thing for me, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think my experience, I don't know if this was your experience, but I just thought everybody had that issue, right? Like,
Right.
I didn't realize that that wasn't how everybody experienced the world. And I would have these glimpses. Like, I remember when my daughter was a baby, and one of my husband's aunts was asking me how it was going, and she was probably like 6 or 8 months. And I remember like being, kind of laughing and being like, oh, it's really hard. And her response was, that's funny. I didn't really find it that hard. And I was like, what? Like,
Right.
because, those moments of realizing I would get those glimpses that I was experiencing something very different from other people. But for the most part, I think we assume that studying is super hard for everybody else. And it's
Right.
those are those things that are really hard to tell. Like, how much am I struggling right now in comparison to other people, right? Like, I always use that example of the headache, where I'm like, sometimes when my husband complains about a headache, I'm like, could we switch bodies and I could find out if you actually have a headache or if you're just complaining, right?
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. Can we just switch bodies for a moment? Well, and what you said about when your oldest was 6 months old, I think that was one of the most difficult parts of my entire life, is having a baby and having and I know myself, and I am a highly sensitive person in addition to having the ADHD. I also have some sensory issues that I've learned when my son was diagnosed with sensory issues. But having all that needs to happen to keep your kids alive just it felt like a lot. Like, how I'm looking around at all these other people. Now, I did have 2 kids who were neurodivergent, right? So that's another layer. But just my staying on top of feedings and all of the things, it was tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I hear you. And your kids are much closer in age than mine are. I feel like I had to, my kids are 4.5 years apart, and I don't know how I could have done it if they weren't, if they were closer together. And I always want to give those moms a hug who have kids who are close in age, in those years. Because it's definitely the hardest thing I've ever been through.
Yeah.
So far, I have a teenager now, so I don't know. The jury's out.
The teenage, so is the infant toddler stage and the adolescent stage. Woo-wee.
Yeah, I know, right?
It's interesting. It's a different kind of hard. It's more of a mental hard, and we're having infants and toddlers is felt more physical hard.
Like boot camp. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Like, oh, okay. There'll be no resting here.
So I want to get back to my question about like, what were some of those resources that really helped you when you were first doing research and deep diving? And do you remember, like, for me, it was the Sari Solden book. First of all, the book on women and attention deficit disorder, which she wrote in the 90s. That really, really changed it all for me in terms of like, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about ADHD?
Right. Katie, those are, I'm looking over at my bookshelf, but those are the 2 that stand out for me. She's a beautiful soul, and I'm a very spiritual person. It's kind of that my ADHD has taken me down the spiritual route, the mind, body, soul route. And I love the way that she brings spirituality in a way that is not woo woo, I guess. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Those 2 books are the ones I've tried to read. Some of the others I do listen. I do audio books. I use Audible a lot when I'm in the car. What helped too is Debbie Reber's book, Differently Wired, and it's not necessarily about ADHD, but it was about and she doesn't have, and it's not about women with ADHD, but it is about about seeing your kids, about helping your kids who are neurodivergent. But the Sari Solden, especially that radical, the last one with Michelle Frank, I think. Yeah, that was it. I love that. I listened to that several times. And I use it, and I like to buy the book and get the Audible, and so that I can make notes, I can listen, and then I can go back and reference,
Same. Yeah. I've done that with Russell Barkley's book too, where I was listening to it and I'm like, oh, I'm going to need this, and I'm going to need this in multiple forms. Taking charge of adult ADHD. Taking charge of adult ADHD is the one I think I read of his. He's written many, but yeah.
Right.
So let's get to the spirituality aspect. I'm curious, your podcast is called A Vision Driven Mom. And what is a vision driven life?
Well, right around the time that my son turned 3, right around the time when I pulled my life apart and didn't know what to do. I had everything. It's kind of like you're cleaning out the closet and you take everything out of the closet and you can't put it back in again, right? It won't. There are things that will not go back in the closet. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just wish I could put all of this back in the closet. My marriage, all of my relationships, my home, like everything. But right around that time, I had been looking to become a coach. I knew that I wanted to be a coach, a life coach, and then I knew that I wanted to help work with moms. And right around that time, I'd been on the yoga mat at this point, 30 years. I started in 1992. So I've been on the yoga mat for decades. Yoga, meditation, healing, energetic healing, and those kinds of things. But I felt great on the yoga mat. But then once I would roll up the mat, I'd be right back in my head and right back into my life, which seemed to be up in my head, right? So right around the time when I had everything pulled out of the closet and I really was on my knees, like praying, like, I need help. I do not know what to do next. Right around that time, I met my coach. And she introduced me to this work. As soon as I started working with her, I knew that that was it. And she taught how to live from, with intention, like based on a vision, rather than, we tend to, as a society, and our parents teach us this way too, we live our life based on what's in front of us, right? Based on our circumstances. We can only have this if we do this, right? It's all circumstance based. Living a vision driven life is a moving toward what you want rather than pushing away from what you don't. Completely different way of living life. It just worked for my ADHD mind. And here's why. So, and this is interesting too. So I became a coach, and then I've been a coach since 2016. And in the beginning, I was speaking to moms, like all moms. And then I realized that, you know what? I'm not speaking to all moms because they have no idea what I'm talking about. So I made the shift and started speaking to moms with ADHD, and I'm getting the head nods, right? Oh yeah. Like, okay, that's because not everybody knows what the heck's going on in my brain. Mm-hmm. But so living a vision-driven life is deciding ahead of time what you want, deciding what your absolute yes is, deciding what your absolute no is too. Because when we know our no's, we can create solutions. We can create solutions to our challenges, if that makes sense. And then we can turn it around so we're moving towards something rather than moving away. And for ADHD, it's brilliant because it's interesting and it's important. So you're focusing on, because you're deciding, right? What's interesting and what's important to me. This is what I'm focusing on. And this is what works for our ADHD minds, right? What's interesting and important. So it's a very different way, powerful way, and I will never go back. I mean, I dip here and there, but I will never go back to the old way. It doesn't work for me. but moving forward and being excited about something. And I was thinking about this before we got on today, Katie, and I was thinking about how I've been able to, because you and I started our podcast right around the same time, about how I've been able to stay consistent with this podcast, because it's important and it's interesting. That's why. Right? There's no magic there. I mean, I guess we could call it magic, but does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, it's really interesting. I've never put it that way in terms of the mix of the interesting and important. I feel like I've talked around that, but I really love how you've paired those two together, because I think that is really key in terms of, so many of us feel, like we play whack-a-mole with our interests, right?
Goodness, right.
And so when it comes to like, how do I, and then feeling like at the end of the day, we've done nothing because we abandoned the important things for the interesting things. And in the moment, the interesting thing feels like, absolutely, this is where I want to go, right? Like one of the things I think I struggle with a lot is just like, I have a hard time. Everything feels like a hell yes, right? Like I remember hearing that advice once where it was like, if it's not a hell yes, then it's a no when it comes to business decisions. But like in the moment, I get so excited and I just feel so urgent and, I can't not do things because everything feels like a hell yes. And so, and then and then I abandoned the thing that I was working on for the new bright and shiny object. And I feel like, that's something that I've had to really work on, which is, coming up with like a theme in terms of like my year, right? Where I'm like, okay, this theme is the podcast. And so if I want to chase a new shiny object, it has to somehow enhance or relate to the theme of the podcast. That's
exactly it.
Right? And so that's what it is. It's marrying the interesting and the important. And if I can't figure out how this helps with the overarching theme, then I'm not going to chase it. And so that has been really helpful for me, but I've never really been able to articulate, right?
I'm writing that down.
I do that every year because New Year's resolutions never worked for me.
No.
And thankfully I had a business coach who really was talking me through this idea of like, of identifying what are the important things? And then when you are chasing something new and interesting, how can all roads lead back to the important things?
Right.
If that makes sense, right? But it's really, but with an interest driven nervous system, like that is really important to be able to kind of, have that ability to hold, I guess, what am I even trying to, I lost my thought. I think I'm trying to say like, it's important to understand what the important things are so that when we don't want to do them anymore, we can figure out how to make them interesting and then also not chase things that are interesting if they're not somehow related to the important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I learned this from a business coach years ago, but is that I have what I call a green room. So I use a Trello board that's like a project management. It's like my whole entire life is in this. It's a project management tool for business, but I keep everything in there. I keep my entire life, and I have a what's called a list of, and I call it the green room. Okay, so anything like writing a book, like I know that I have at least several books in me, but last year was not the year for the book. This year is not the year for the book, but I have a list where I can put all of my thoughts and ideas so they're safe. So they don't have to keep coming back in my mind like, oh, what about that book? Oh, what about that retreat? Oh, what about the YouTube channel that you've been wanting to start, right? It's all in my green room, so it's safe. If that makes sense. So I don't have to spin around in my mind about it. And that has been super helpful. And I do this with my family too, with my family life and different aspects of life.
I love that you call it safe because that's such an ADHD concept, right?
Right? I'm like, oh God, I can't lose it. No, don't lose it.
I talk about that too with parking things, but
with the parking things. So that's exactly it.
Right?
We're parking things in the green room.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's like we have all of these metaphors and all of these images for the same concept, which is like the brain dump, right? Which is like, I don't want to lose this, but I also know that it's not a right now thing. And so what do I do with it? How do I keep it safe? And for me, I'm like, where can I park it? So I'm like, if this is not a today thing, I need to decide when I can revisit it.
Right. Exactly. And revisit it every once in a while. Is it still, how does it feel? I do this expansion contraction test in my, it's part of what I teach is kind of learning your nervous system and what your intuition is trying to tell you. Is it time? Not right now. This like kind of using your beautiful, unique nervous system to guide you.
Right? Yeah. But then also realizing that once you've taken care of it, once you've kept it safe, it doesn't take up the same amount of space in your brain.
Like in the middle of the night? Right? Like when you're driving and you can't do anything about it?
The shower. Oh my goodness. Right?
Right.
All the ideas that happen in the shower. And then the minute I get out of the shower, they're gone forever. Like, And I love the idea that there's shower notes and like that you could actually keep track of shower thoughts. But I'm also just like, at some point I have to stop keeping track. Like it's for my own sanity. Sometimes I have to let things go.
Right. I think you might be the one who introduced me to the shower thing. And of course, that is something I didn't put in the green room. I don't know. Or maybe I've heard you talk about it on the podcast. I'm like, that's brilliant.
I know, right? And when I first discovered that those existed, I was like, oh, I need that for the shower. But then I was like, really? Like, maybe I should just wash my hair.
Right.
Like, maybe I shouldn't always be brain dumping. But it's hard, right? Because it's like you want to hold on to those things.
Because we have brilliant minds, Katie, right? We have so much brilliance that moves through our minds like it.
Right? Yeah, that's
lightning speed.
Right? Oh my goodness. Now, is this concept of the interesting and important, that vision driven, is that similar to the FAB framework, the focus, align, become, or is that a separate concept? What is the
It is
FAB
all part
concept?
of it. So yeah, the FAB framework, which is kind of the framework that I take clients through. It kind of like all of the pieces of the work that I do all fit into the FAB framework. So the FAB framework is focus, and that's where the interesting and important would fall under. So, and focus means focusing on yourself, knowing yourself. Like there are so many ways to know yourself, but I like to start with core values, like really knowing who you are at your core. A quick story: when my kids were born, I put family first. Right? That was it. That was my thing. I put family first. This is what you're supposed to do, right? And I was miserable. I went through my core values with my coach and discovered mine is growth, personal growth. If I'm not growing, I feel dead inside, right? So for all of us, we're all different, right? But knowing who you are and focusing on that, like how can I bring more of that's deep inside of me? How can I bring more of that into life? For one thing, we're more joyful. It is important and interesting because it's what's important to us. And then and then deciding what you want, right? Deciding what is really important and interesting to me in the next year, in the next 3 years. 5-10 years is a little much for us with ADHD, I think, but that's kind of the focus part. Aligning is aligning your thoughts and your energy, right? The way that you feel with who you're becoming. And that's the B is the becoming. That's the actual action, like taking action. If I was this person who had the podcast, my podcast had been rolling around for maybe 5 years, a long time. It'd been rolling around in my mind for about at least 5 years before I actually did it. But what if I was this woman who had the podcast? What would I do? Oh, I would research podcasts. Oh, like taking the steps. So FAB, the F is focus. The A is aligning, because the late great Wayne Dyer was known to say, you don't get what you want, you get who you are. So that means being who you are, being who you are envisioning yourself to be now, because we don't get from A to Z. We don't get from this depressed woman to this woman who feels amazing and loves her life, if that makes sense. There are steps in between, right? So we become every day. We align every day, and we stay focused on what's in that, what's important and interesting. That can change. It should morph and change as long as we're growing, but we don't want to change it every day, which is hard for those of us with the shiny object syndrome. Is that what it's called? Shiny objects.
Shiny object syndrome. I like that.
Yeah, I think, isn't that what it's called? I don't know, something like that. But the shot, like, it's the squirrel. Oh, ooh, that looks great.
I liked that. I don't know. Maybe I've heard of it. I don't know. I have terrible memory, of course. But
I get you.
okay, so now how does that tie into getting in touch with your spiritual side in terms of, because I know you've talked about your spiritual side helping you manage your ADHD. Is that all sort of coming back to the same idea? Or what is spiritual for you?
Yeah, for me, I mean, the knowing yourself, knowing what lights you up, it's kind of how spirit expresses through you. When you are those little joyful moments that we can have through the day that we sometimes forget because we're so busy. I have chickens out in my backyard. Oh my God, the joy that I get from my chickens, or petting my cat, or hula hooping. I have a hula hoop. Just little things that we can do bring us back to the essence of who we are. So I'm not talking that we don't have to go and sit and, live in an ashram for 6 months. No, it's little things that we can bring into our life every day. Now, yoga, which I absolutely love, and I've tried all kinds of different modalities over the past 30 years. But that's the most effective way that I have found to connect mind, body, and soul. So and you can connect with your essence, or your soul, that deepest part of you, whatever you want to call it, God, whatever it is to you. But you can connect with that in a couple of different ways, and they can kind of seem very opposite, but they are the way that spirit speaks through you, is through meditation. When you're still, and you can actually discern what's the small still voice, and what's my ego. So the more that you practice meditation, the easier it is to determine what am I hearing? Am I hearing, because the ego is very strong, right? And the other way is fun and joy. Like that, when you feel lit up, that's you are connected to your soul. You're connected to that spiritual part of you. So it doesn't have to be this, like we're sitting in meditation for 30 days, or like I said, going in the ashram. We don't have to go to India to be spiritual. I just lost my earring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I just, I love all of the ways in which you've connected that to the spiritual element.
Yeah,
too,
and knowing
right?
yourself, right? Knowing yourself, who you really are, what makes you tick, what's important to you, knowing your core values. That's knowing, the more we know ourselves, the more we know, the better we do, right? The more we know ourselves, the more we know what is a yes for me and what's a no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also too, the more we can accept the fact that we are on the right path,
right, is
really important too. And I always feel like the wizard behind the curtain when I say stuff like that, where I'm like, you had the answer inside of you all along. But
that's it.
I think we can get lost in feeling convinced that the answer is out there somewhere. Right. And that it's at the end of the next self-help book, or it's at the end of the next course or certification or whatever. I feel like we are often chasing a sense of confidence and knowledge that is it's always going to elude us until we really turn inward in a way that, it doesn't have to be woo-woo, but also realizing that like we have all the tools we need. We were born with them.
Do. We have everything that we need. It's just, we kind of become conditioned with our patterns of thinking and our patterns of being that we've learned from our well-meaning parents, from society, right? And when we can kind of reset, when we can kind of peel back the layers. I had worked with a woman one time and she said, oh my gosh, like I didn't even know that all I had to do was like pull back the curtain. It's like, oh, that's so beautiful. I love a visual. She's like, I pulled back the curtain and there I was. Like, how lovely. It doesn't have to be that hard, right?
Yeah. And I think that's another thing that can be so wonderful about the diagnosis of ADHD is really being able to take the mask off, as we often use the masking metaphor.
Absolutely.
Is to take that mask off and be like, who am I behind this, and how can I live authentically and accept who I am and all of the wonderful, crazy chaos
Right.
in a way that is, not without shame. I think that's so important. Yeah. Oh. Now, speaking of ADHD, what would you say you love most about your ADHD?
I guess, now I don't know about all of us women with ADHD, but I feel like we tend to feel our way through lives, and I think that's really cool. I love that I use my five senses in my life, right? I love that I'm intuitive. I love that I can walk into a room and feel energy. Now that I've learned how to separate what's my energy and what's somebody else's, because that was tough. But there are parts of us that are really beautiful and can really support us in life, in this, in being, I hope I'm not being too woo, but that we are spiritual beings in a human form, and we get to experience this life with all the senses. And when we know our ADHD, when we know it well, we're better able to use that to our advantage. I guess one of the other things is I sometimes I don't love the big emotions, but how beautiful that I can be so touched to cry, that the emotions are so big and beautiful that I'm touched deeply in ways. And I think the other thing is the creativity, and I'm not necessarily an artist, or I one day I'd love to be a singer, but I don't sing so yet. But we are really creative in accommodations, right? And in making accommodations for ourselves in life. I guess those would be the three: the intuitiveness, the loving that I get to feel in big, beautiful ways, and creativity.
Right. Well, I think, it's interesting to me when you had talked about your values and your core values as being personal growth. And I think it's creative, right? I mean, I think that is a creative project. And we often talk about like how, I certainly often felt selfish that I was so fascinated by myself, where I was like,
fascinating though, Katie, isn't it? I am fascinating. The ADHD brain is fascinating.
It is, right? But just the psychology of relationships and talking about it endlessly and navel gazing, like all of that I find so interesting. And, I remember hearing a quote once that was like, there's no hobby that is more fascinating to me than myself. And it's like, oh, I related to that. But yeah, I think it is a form of creativity, right? It is such a, it's an exercise of the brain and the mind. And
right.
It is endlessly fascinating. And I love the fact that the one, that you've sort of come full circle in terms of this criticism of you as being a chameleon has become one of your favorite things about yourself, which is that empathic side, the reading the room, right? That I always called it the vibe, being able to respond in a very intentional, personal way with energy, and I think being able to shift and be malleable in that way is such an important gift. And so I love the way that you've been able to reframe that for yourself.
Thank you. It took a long time.
Right.
I will not lie. There's a lot of growth that had to happen before I was able to do that.
Yeah. Right. I mean,
but then the pandemic hit and we were all here and I was like, but then I had to come back to my own, to my own practices and my own, my own work. Like, I got this. It's okay. I can handle this.
I love that. So if you could rename ADHD to something else, I mean, you've already said it was shiny object syndrome, which I kind of love, but do you have a name for it that you would call it if you could?
Yeah, I was thinking about this last night, and I would call it creative attentionality. I think creative attentionality. And so, and one thing that comes to mind is, are you familiar with Holderness family?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So they're local. They live in my town. And, so they were on The Amazing Race, and I think it was 2020, and then they had to shut it down. And I don't know exactly the whole story. Anyway, Penn Holderness has ADHD, and his ability to hyper-focus is what won them the Amazing Race. He used his creative attentionality, right?
All right. Yeah. I love that.
I like to think that, in my own life, there are different things, different adaptations that I've made in my life to help me to stay focused. Like if I put a pot of water to boil on the stove, I set a timer for 5 minutes so I don't burn the house down. Like it's creative attentionality, right? I'm setting the timer so that I am aware that I have, because I can easily walk out. I mean, I did this when my kids were little, when I was making baby food. 3 times I burnt, we had to evacuate the house because I burnt pots. So anyway, I just think that when we really know ourselves, Katie, when we really know ourselves and how our ADHD presents and what it looks like for us, then we're able to use it in creative ways.
I love that. I think it was a TikTok video once that said the real ADHD test is not how often you lose your keys, but how elaborate the system is that you have to not lose your keys.
Got it. I know, me too. I'm like, I usually do not lose my stuff because I've got such a rigid system for myself, right?
Right. I know. I'm like, every one of us is like, I've got a system for that.
Exactly. I mean, how beautiful is that?
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you, Tracy. This has been lovely. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I feel very connected to you in our journeys. So where can people find more of you? I know I'll have a link to the podcast, but what about working with you? And where can we find more of you?
Yes, absolutely. I'm at Vision Driven Mom on Instagram. Vision Driven Mom with ADHD.com is my website. I'm on Vision Driven Mom with ADHD Facebook. And yes, please reach out, say hello, let me know that you heard this interview and any takeaways. That would be fantastic. But yeah, the podcast is my labor of love. It's been amazing. I get to meet the most brilliant women on the planet, like you, Katie. I mean, it's been amazing. So have a listen, come over and say hi.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, do you work one-on-one or with groups, or what are some of the coaching?
I do. Now I'm actually, by the time this airs, I will have done, I do this every year. It's called the ADHD Reset. It wasn't ADHD before, like I said, it was all moms who were like, what are you talking about? But it's kind of like, it's my version of starting the year and kind of letting go of what, it's kind of like mental decluttering and moving forward, envisioning. But I do work in groups, and I do work one-on-one if it's absolutely the right fit. But you can come to my website and the ADHD Supports is a freebie that is really supportive for women with ADHD on the journey, and kind of the different ways, different categories of putting your support system in place. And it's not just people. There are other things that you can do as well. But you can find all of that on the website and on my link tree as well in Instagram.
Awesome. Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you again so much. It's been a real pleasure getting to know a little bit more about your story, and I love your philosophy. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Katie. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to more.